My name's Kristen Tolleson. I'm the education director here at the Bainbridge Island Museum of Art, and I'm also a Carleton alum. And so it's a particular pleasure for me to introduce Fred today. I had all these things rattling around in my head about what I wanted to say that was cute or, reference something that we would all share as an in-joke. But all I could come up with was this page, which some of you may have been seen out on the table, that I've actually carried around since 1985 and just unearthed, just coincidentally. It is a list of questions that Fred created for an exhibit that was at the museum about women's art. And during the mid-'80s, women's art was a big deal because people, can women even make art? Why have there been no famous women artists? So one question just jumps out as one of the things that I want to highlight about Fred being a curious mind. It's question number 1. It says, have you seen it? If not, why not? And I think that is such a great introduction to someone who is looking at the world, trying to make sense of it, trying to help other people see injustice, beautiful stories, lyricism, and all through the lens of somebody who is a master technician. This is not somebody who's just hacking things together. It's somebody who really knows how to create a beautiful statement visually. So I'm really honored to welcome Fred Hagstrom to the stage.
Hello. First of all, it's very nice to be here. Been here a few days now. One thing, if I am blowing it with the microphone, you let me know, please. And I might repeat a couple things that were said. We had a panel last night, but I kind of only have one sort of me. And so if I repeat a couple things, please forgive me. So I'm going to start with this. This is a slide that probably surprises you in a talk about books, but I have to start with it. So since 1996, I've been taking students to the South Pacific. And the reason I have 2 reasons for talking about this. One is it's a very big part of what I do. I've taken 300 students there. I have deep connections there, and it's meant a lot to me both as a teacher and an artist. So I'm just going to explain this just a little bit. And I just got back. I just got back from a 10-week trip. So this is the Cook Islands. And the woman at the back there is a really good artist, and she does a form of art called tivaivai, and the students are learning how to make tivaivai. So we start in a little island called Rarotonga out in the middle of the Pacific. Then we go to New Zealand, and the highlight of our time in New Zealand is when we stay with a Maori tribe at what's called a marae. And this is our leaving ceremony at the marae, so that's called the hangi, when you push noses together. So I'm doing this fast. I do a lot with the legacy of colonialism and the lives of indigenous people in today's society. So this is in Melbourne, talking about Emily Kanyari's work. She's one of the greatest indigenous painters from Australia. And then I also do quite a bit with ecological issues, and so we get to go to the Great Barrier Reef, and I teach them how to snorkel, and here they're doing a reef walk. So I talk about this because it's a very important part of what I've done, but also to say that I've got a connection with the Pacific. It just happens to be the other side. And but we're going to move here in 2 years. And so I really appreciate being invited here for lots of reasons, and to have my work shown and be a part of an important collection, but also to start to make connections here. And that seems to be off to a pretty good start. So anyway, that's why I showed those slides. Okay, my background is in printmaking. And one of the reasons that I really love printmaking is its history. And its history has a great tradition of making social comment. So this is Kate Kollwitz, who made amazing pieces about motherhood and war and class issues. And this is a scene of a mother looking to identify her son on a battlefield. Certainly Goya sticks out in this for me. So my influences are probably more historical than contemporary. And Otto Dix, this is from his war series, he was a machine gunner during World War I. And then in contemporary times as well, Foucault is somebody that I have a lot of respect for. And Eric Avery, who was both an artist and a doctor, and so would spend 3 days a week at clinic and 2 days a week being an artist, and now is not a clinician anymore. So now we're going to do a more predictable thing for a books thing and start talking about books. So the way I'm going to do this, I'm going to talk about 5 or 6 books. I'm going to give you a really short synopsis of what the story is. My books really need to know what the story is, so I mentioned this last night, I try to make them readable in 10 minutes. And to me, I kind of go back to the golden books when we were kids, Golden Book of Dinosaurs, Golden Book of the Sun, things like that. But I'm trying to sort of update that. And it's an interesting thing to work within a strict limitation like that. So I'm trying to boil down kind of a complex story into something that can come with both image and word and have a kind of a impact in a short period of time. This is the first book that I did that was about historical subjects. Before this, I did a public works project where we did books that I thought were relevant to high school students, and we sent them out for free to high school libraries, sort of messages in bottles, and hopefully they're still there. And then I did some books where I was sort of working with poets, but then this was the first time I did a historical book, and then that kind of set a trend that I was doing. It's a really important story for me. It's called Deeply Honored. And it's about the incarceration of Japanese Americans, and in particular, it's a Carleton story. So there's a room at Carleton called the Frank Sugimura room, and I knew about this room, and then that sent me to the archives. And in the archives are all the letters that document his life, his coming to Carleton, and his death, and then his parents' contact with the college in the years after. So I'm going to give you sort of a brief rundown of this. With each of the books I'm going to do, I'm going to talk about what the story is, and then just give you a couple excerpts of text so that you know what it sounds like, okay? So this is Frank Sugimura. He was incarcerated at Minidoka camp, and then volunteered for the 442nd, the segregated Japanese unit, out of Minidoka. And, well, actually, there was something in between. This man, John Nason, was president of Carleton during the 60s, which is a tough time to be president of any college. But he was president of Swarthmore when the war started. He was a very young president. He was also a Carleton grad of the late 20s. And being president of Swarthmore, when the war began, he started something called the Student Relocation Council. And this was a 2-part thing. On the East Coast, it was him trying to talk any college or university in the exclusion zone to offer scholarships to get students out of the camps. And then on the West Coast, there was a placement service. So they would talk to the students in the camps, and they were placing students in graduate programs, and undergraduate programs, all across the country. And over the course of the war, they got 4,000 students out of the camps. Frank Sugimura was the first to come to Carleton. 12 came to Carleton. When he arrived, he tried to enlist. So this book is about life in the camps, but more importantly about the life of Frank Sugimura and his family. So this is the first page. A book has an end paper, so when you open this up, the first page is this identification card of a woman, and then at the back, the last end paper is an identification card of the male. One of the things I really like about books is that they have a rhythm to them, and so what the cover is, what the inside page is, what the title page is, all that sort of thing helps to sort of create the story. So this is the title page. This is a booklet that Carleton printed after the war. 54 guys from Carleton died in the war. So they did this memorial booklet, and they sent it out to all the families. And when they sent it out, Mrs. Sugimura received this and wrote back to the college. She was an extremely generous person. And so when she wrote back, she said, I was really happy to receive this pamphlet. I want to pay for it. So she wanted to pay for the publication of it. And this began a long correspondence between her and the then president of Carleton, Larry Gould. This is why I did this book. This is the honor roll at Minidoka, so that shows the names of the soldiers who are serving. And on the right, so what my text is all the letters from the Carleton Archive, the letter of Frank coming to school, the letter of the dean who wrote to get him accepted into the army, even though the local draft board wouldn't take him because he was Japanese. Then the condolence letter that he writes to the parents while they're still in camp and saying, I got your son into the army and now he's not coming back. So it's very, very moving things. But nothing is as moving as Mrs. Sugimura's letter. So this is her. We deeply feel honored in having Frank's picture in a memorial booklet honoring Carleton College Gold Star men. It is hard to realize that Frank will never return. I can only say that I am thankful that he was able to serve his country, God, and us all. I shall always be proud to be a mother of a true American. Frank has often mentioned in his letters about the fair treatment and kindness he received from both the faculty and the students of Carleton College. I cannot find words adequate enough to fully express our thanks. We are ever and ever so grateful to you all. So Mrs. Sugimura had lost her only son and had been incarcerated for around 3 years, and they lost all their worldly goods, and that's what she writes. And what I try to do in my books is I try to bring people back. I try to find people that have done something that I think is kind of extraordinary, and for her to be that kind of dignified after what she has endured, I think is really, really something. And so that's the core of my book. And what I try to do with images and with words is just to convey that. And hopefully, then for me, the trick is finding a good story. And I think with the Sugimuras, that was quite easy. So this is President Gould, and he writes back to her, and it's lovely. I mean, he develops a great friendship with them, and he expresses, he knows right away how important their generosity is to Carleton. Not so much because it's the money, but because of where it comes from. So this is, again, more text, and this is Frank's image. This is what I did in the book. So before you saw what his images look like in photographs, and this is how I did it, and you get an idea what the book looks like. So this is an image of a funeral. The other day, because I had a little bit of time in Seattle, I went and visited Frank Sugimura's grave. So this is one of the burials. And then this is the Sugimuras visiting Carleton, and on your right is Annie Kaneshiro, and she's the first recipient of Frank Sugimura Scholarship. And she was not going to be able to finish her senior year for economic reasons, and then the scholarship allowed her to do that. And the Sugimuras were invited by Carleton and came out in the 50s to visit, and it's the only time they traveled from Seattle other than to go to the camp. And so that's her hosting the Sugimuras, and that's my book page. And in conclusion, a really important part of this story is that Mr. and Mrs. Sugimura kept donating to the school. And then in the 50s, somebody from Carleton came out and said, well, we need to look the Sugimuras up. And they said, oh, well, Mr. Sugimura works here in the station. He's a porter. So that's how Carleton found out that they were giving all their money to the college. They were living off tips, and they lived in a one-room apartment with hardly any furniture, and were giving everything they had to the school. So then the president writes these lovely letters trying to talk them out of any more contributions to the college. And they're very diplomatic and very sweet. And then these things are like a movie. The next president of Carleton is John Nason. And at one point, when Mr. Sugimura dies, Mrs. tries to set up an estate. And this lawyer writes and says, what do you want me to do? They want to set up an estate, but really they don't have any money. And I think about John Nason, who was so important to the Japanese community, getting that letter and sitting in his office and thinking, well, that's one of 4,000 stories. That must have been lovely. So that book led me in a way to Seattle and led me to do this story. And this is Shiro Kashino, and his daughter is here today. So through, I guess, recognition of the Sugimura book, I was contacted by Debbie Kashino, and she and her family are prominent members of the Nisei Veterans Committee in Seattle. And how that committee came about, or how that organization came about, is when the Japanese soldiers returned to Washington after the war. Even though they had served, they were not allowed to join the VFW or the American Legion, so they started their own organization. And it still goes today, and it's people like Debbie and her family that keep it going. So, I didn't expect another story to be related to this, but here it came. So, Mr. Kishino was, by any measure, a great hero of the 442nd. He volunteered out of Minidoka. So you can imagine volunteering to go to war when the rest of your family is still behind barbed wire. He wanted to prove his loyalty and had met Mrs. Kishino at camp. So this is them. I don't remember if this is wedding time or yet. I don't think it was. No, because they got married later. But anyway, they're together. That's good. And then he went to war. So I balance it together with war photographs. So this is one of the basically food lines and that sort of thing. So why this story is important is that, as I said, Mr. Kishino was really he was a leader and a hero. They weren't allowed to be officers. He achieved the rank of sergeant. He received multiple medals and was in all their most prominent battles. At one point he was wounded seriously and could have come home and refused to do so and rejoined his unit. But an incident happened, and during downtime, he was in a bar when a Japanese soldier punched a white soldier, and they got rounded up, and he got blamed for it. So he lost his rank and was court-martialed, and except was pulled out when they needed him to fight another battle, and then was put back in the stockade. So it was a really terribly unfair treatment. And after the war, the 442nd started having reunions. This is the family attending one of the reunions in Hawaii. And this is when Debbie, who's here, began to recognize what her father had meant to the other members of the 442nd. So I balance this in the book. Remember, I'm trying to think of the rhythm of pictures and words and that sort of thing, with pictures of photographs of, say, camp time, together with images like this. So, an important part of this story is that after some of those reunions, some of the other soldiers of the 442nd felt that his treatment was so unfair that they started a movement to try to restore his reputation and his rank. This took decades. Records had been lost. Appeals were abandoned or rejected, and it all became very complicated and went into the 90s. So I'm going to read a little bit of text about this effort to try to restore his rank and reputation. This is one brief text, and I did read it last night, so sorry to repeat for some of you. So this is, at this point, his last appeal to try to have his rank restored has failed, and Mrs. Kishino writes this. If this application can be reconsidered and the stigma of a court-martial of dubious circumstances erased, we will be grateful knowing that justice has been served and my husband vindicated. If the application is once again denied, my only consolation will be the fact that he died not knowing that he had lost his last battle. So, pretty powerful letter. It did the trick. So his rank was restored. That's very important. Unfortunately, it did come after his death. And another part of the text from the book that I thought you should hear some of his words. So this is Shiro Kishino. After the war was over, we had to guard some German prisoners. I remember looking down on this compound, and it reminded me of camp. This was exactly what they had built for us in the deserts of Idaho. So like Mrs. Sugimura, that idea of a kind of like dignity and loyalty being asserted with having experienced these really terrible things is just something that really stands out to me. Okay. In a way, this is related to my first two stories. This is a photograph by Stan Honda. So on September 12th, so this is September 11th, on September 12th, this photograph was in the Minneapolis paper, printed full size. And my wife looked at it and she was totally struck by it. But I had to go off to work, so I went down to school. And both of us on that day ran into people who said to us, they should lock the Muslims up like they did the Japanese. And so by the time I got home, my wife, S, had found out that this photograph was by Stan Honda, who's a news photographer for Agence France Presse. And that in addition to his work for Agence France, that his family had been incarcerated, and he had a whole other body of work about the camps and about their family and that sort of thing. So she had his email, she had the whole thing all researched by the time I got home. So because we had run into these people that suggested this, I wrote to him right away, and I said, we were really moved by your photograph, but this thing happened to us where issues of civil liberties and the Japanese came up. Would you be willing to come to Carleton and talk about your photographs, but also to extend that to the issue of civil liberties? And so he came out really early in October. So you can think back to how we all felt at that time, right? And so really just a few weeks after the event that he was there, so Carleton, the auditorium in Carleton was totally packed. And I remember telling him, some people will not know that the incarceration happened. He goes, really? And I said, oh yeah, that's right. So he started, he did his September 11th thing, and then he started talking about his family and that sort of thing. And people, again, said, what is he talking about? And again, like I grew up not knowing anything about this till I went to college. So I'm not at all surprised by that. But the reason I'm showing this is that one of the things that Stan did for working for Agence France, he would go to auto shows, he would go to sporting events, golf tournaments, tennis tournaments, that sort of thing, but they sent him to Iraq. So this is a book called When I First Arrived in Baghdad, and I did it together with Stan, and it's just quotes from what his life was like there. He went for 2 different tours of time in Iraq, one of which was, I don't know if you've ever seen the photograph that proved that Saddam Hussein's sons were killed. So he had to go into an air-conditioned tent and photograph them when they were dead to sort of be the proof to the Arab world that this had happened. So he had all kinds of really bizarre experiences. So this is Stan working on his computer, sending photographs back to Agence France. This is one of his photographs. This is one of the house raids. And then this is how it was adapted into my book. So on the right side is a pretty good clip from the photo, and then on the left side is this kind of grayed out detail, and then with the text, and the text all just comes from what Stan told me. So that's basically how the book works. So again, here's another one of Stan's photographs of a man being handcuffed while the women look on. This is the way it looks in the book. I thought this was a pretty important image of this boy with this gun. And then that is how that translated into the book. So a couple brief texts from this book about Iraq. This is Stan's voice now. I didn't do anything except for just put his words in straight. I would take trips to Fallujah or Ramadi or other nearby towns. My wife and sisters and father were very worried, but I managed to stay in touch by email and occasionally by calling on the satellite phone. I felt for the soldiers who were out there in the tremendous heat in full fatigues, body armor, helmet, and backpack, and carrying large rifles. I was equipped with a flak vest and a helmet, but I had the advantage of lightweight camping clothes and no weapon, just cameras. This is a book called Paradise Lost. It's about the effects of the first nuclear tests in the Marshall Islands. So the 4th and 5th nuclear explosions in history happened at Bikini Atoll. And it was a test to supposedly prove or test what would happen to a navy, whether or not navies were irrelevant now in the nuclear age. What they found out through all this is if you drop a bomb on a ship, it sinks. But they went to great lengths to prove that. So this is the cover of Paradise Lost. It shows a woman with kind of like a radiation pattern happening. And I did it because I read this book. This is called No Place to Hide. And it's by somebody that was in charge of the radiological team. They really didn't know what they were doing. And so what this is about is explaining that things just got out of control. There was actually supposed to be a 3rd bomb, but there was just so much radiation all over the place that they abandoned that partway through. So this is a fairly famous photograph of one of the explosions. So Bikini has this large, it's an atoll island, so this is the ships are out in the lagoon. They took a bunch of derelict ships and put them out there. So do you see that kind of dark spot on the right part of the plume going up? That's a ship, okay? So the sad thing about this, and this is how it looks in the book, number of sad things about this, but a big part of it is that they convinced the Bikini Islanders that this was really important for world peace, to test out and see what these weapons were going to do. And the Bikini Islanders had no concept of what they were really saying, getting involved with. They thought they could go back home. And actually, as they were leaving on the ship and looking back to their island is when the Navy started burning their houses. And that's when they started to get the idea that this wasn't going to work out very well. And unfortunately, they were brought to another island where there was very bad fishing. So despite the millions of dollars that were spent on this, the Bikini Islanders started to starve. And I just find this just to be an amazing story that a lot of people don't know a lot about. This is the plane that dropped the first bomb. One came from plane and one came from down below. And so this is the way it kind of translates into my book. This is one of the scenes of the islanders leaving, putting their things on launches to leave the island. This is the way it looks in the book, so it would be text over on the left, and then that page. And then this page of the sailors watching. So I'm going to read a couple of quick texts from this book, Paradise Lost. This first one is from it's called Operation Crossroads. So Operation Crossroads, a sailor and a cancer victim. I don't recall in our whole time there being any words of I don't recall in our whole time there any words of radioactive being spoken of. Not us, the crew members. We were never told about radioactive exposure. In fact, we didn't know what the word was. We were caught in what they called the downwind of this. I was standing there and got a lot of mist, sand, pieces of rock. Within 10 hours, we were at ground zero. We didn't know anything about what was going on, and no one told us about radiation or being exposed to anything. So they were doing laundry with water from the lagoon right after the explosion. They were sent onto the decks of the ships to scrub off the radiation with mops and buckets. Many of them became ill. This guy was sick by the time they got back to Pearl Harbor and died. And then this quote is from a Bikini Islander. They came and gave us pictures of the bomb. Of course, back then I had no idea what an atomic bomb was. None of us had any idea what it was or that it would do such harm to our island. There is nothing in my life that I want more than to go home to Bikini. The reason I can't go back is because the Americans tell me there is poison there. I don't understand this. I'm asking America to take us home. So that's about the first test that was at Bikini. And then I got interested. I thought, well, why is it still so hot? Why, I mean, people live in parts of Japan that were bombed. Why couldn't they go back? So I started doing some research and working with a colleague at Carleton, Joel Weisberg. I did this book called Bravo. So this actually is around the front and back of the thing, and it's a panorama of the palms in being moved around by the blaze. So unfortunately, they continued to test at Bikini for the better part of a decade and dropped bomb after bomb. One of them, Castle Bravo, was a particularly disastrous test where they had no idea how strong it was going to be, and it ended up being 1,000 times the Hiroshima bomb. And so a lot of people got exposed that they were not expecting. And it was just a big disaster all around. So this book has several chapters. The first one is about the test. The next chapter is about a Japanese fishing boat called the Lucky Dragon that happened to go through the cloud and get exposed. And so then by the time they got back to Japan, they were sick and some died. And then also their catch, but also a lot of the Japanese catch of the tuna catch was contaminated and had to be destroyed. So it was a big problem with Japan, especially this is just not that many years after the war. The third chapter is about the Rainbow Warrior. You might know about the Rainbow Warrior. So after years and years, the islanders were in a contaminated zone and they wanted to be moved, and the U.S. wouldn't move them unless they signed something that said that they would never sue. And so in order to get them out of there without that provision, the Rainbow Warrior moved them. And after they moved them, they took them to, the Rainbow Warrior went to Auckland, New Zealand. Now, some of the students here that just came in had been on my trip. So in Auckland, the harbor is right down at the end of the main street, Queen Street. And so they parked the Rainbow Warrior there. And the next stop was going to go to French Polynesia to protest nuclear tests happening in French Polynesia. But the French sent a frogman right into downtown Auckland and blew the bottom off the boat, killing one of the Greenpeace members. And then unfortunately, they caught the 2 people that were responsible, but France put such pressure on England to release them. So they released them supposedly to go back for imprisonment in France, but when they got back, there were parades and welcomed them and, no ramifications. So the 3rd chapter is about that. And the 4th chapter is about living with radiation. So these are the islanders. In this photograph, the boy is being treated by a doctor for radiation burns. This is the Greenpeace removal. So actually on the right is a elderly woman that was being removed, and on the left is the Greenpeace member that was killed. So I'm going to read a little bit about the text from Bravo. The total yield of nuclear tests in the Marshall Islands was the equivalent of 1.7 Hiroshima shots every day for a period of 12 years. So that answered my question on why they can't go back. There's another quote. It is clear that U.S. officials knowingly exposed Marshall Islanders to contaminated environments in order to learn about the long-term effects of radiation on humans. And this is an actual quote now. While it is true that these people do not live the way Westerners do, civilized people, it is nevertheless also true that they are more like us than mice. So the justification was that we needed to know what was going to happen to people that were exposed to this sort of thing. And they knowingly moved them back. Other things in the book that I'm not going to read here today are stories like of women giving birth to deformed children, nursing them in the moments before they die, and that sort of thing. And I think it's really unconscionable. If you read about the Marshall Islands now, they've really never received any kind of, in my opinion, proper redress for this. So sometimes I work from archives and things that I find. So I found some texts at Carleton and I wanted to do a book on this. So this is about the Atlantic slave trade, and it's a book called Passage. So this is the cover. And the book is based on 2 books that I found in the Carleton archive. This is a fairly famous book about abolition, the Clarkson book about the policy of the African slave trade. And this is another book that we have called Interesting Anecdotes of Persons of Color. And this is all about both words from and about people who lived in slavery. These are these famous images in the Clarkson book that show how the slave ships were, how people were packed into them. These diagrams. So you can imagine a many-month passage in that situation, deck after deck. So this is one of the end pages. So I used some photographs of the shackles, and I did it kind of over that sort of like human wallpaper that came from the Clarkson diagram. This is a man that lived part of his life in slavery. And in the rhythm of the book, I keep repeating these sort of diagram things along with photographs of people that lived in slavery. And then as you go through the book, the figures get bigger. So basically I kind of blow up the sort of woodcutty forms of these sort of diagrammatic slaves, and then by the end they're very large. And I'll just read a couple of the stories that comes from this. And what I like about these is how matter of fact they are. You know, they're not. The drama is just in what they are. They're not dramatized in how they're written. So this one goes, she married and had 2 daughters, one of whom was taken at an early age and placed at so great a distance from her that she never saw her after. Story of Zilpha. About the year 1813, his wife died, and shortly after that, he bought himself and 2 little children for $350. Story of Lot. And so that anecdote book is just full of things like this. And again, it's just not hard to find stuff that I think has a certain story power to it. This book is called When Men Are Hungry. So I'm from Minnesota, and one of the most traumatic events in Minnesota is the 1862 Dakota Uprising. So in the 1850s, the Dakota were forced basically at gunpoint to sign a treaty that limited them down to a fairly small reservation along the Minnesota River. And they couldn't survive, and they were supposed to receive money payments, but they tended to not be on time. And then also, problematically, the traders took so much of the money that the very little trickled down to the natives themselves. There's a really interesting quote by Thomas Jefferson saying, "If we get the Indians in debt, then they'll have to give us land to get out of debt." And that's basically what happened here. Well, what happened in Minnesota, but really what happened almost all over the place. So by 1862, they were starving, and they rebelled in the starvation. And it was a brutal rebellion. White settlers were killed, the Dakota were killed, and in the end, the Dakota were removed from the state. So these are pictures that were taken at Fort Snelling. Fort Snelling still exists. And after the Dakota War, a lot of the male warriors were sent immediately to prison, but there was a really tough winter in Minnesota, and down below in the flats below the fort was the Dakota settlement, mostly for elderly and women. A lot of them died in that winter before they were sent out of the state. So these are these archival pictures that come from the Minnesota Historical Society. This is a man named Chaska. So Chaska actually protected a white woman, and she testified on his behalf to keep him from being hung. The largest mass execution in U.S. history happened in Mankato. 38, a gallows built for 38 people was used. Originally over 300 had been convicted and sentenced to death. Lincoln interceded, and they arrived somehow at 38 names and who were hanged. My doctor, by the way, grew up in Mankato, and when they were kids, used to go to the Historical Society in Mankato, and they had a little replica of the gallows with 38 little bodies, and each kid would come up one after the other and hit the lever to make them drop down. It was kind of an amazing educational experience. Chaska, unfortunately, that is a common name. And so the Chaska that had helped the white woman ended up being hanged, and another Chaska was reprieved. But anyway, this is still a really raw nerve in Minnesota. And so it was touchy even to sort of go for this subject. So I'm going to read a couple segments of text from this. So they had petitioned the traders who had food stores to open them up. And this is the quote from one of the traders, Andrew Myrick. "So far as I'm concerned, if they're hungry, let them eat grass or their own dung." He later was killed with grass stuffed in his mouth, by the way. And this is Little Crow. "We have waited a long time. The money is ours, but we cannot get it. We have no food, but here are these stores filled with food. We ask that you, the agent, make some arrangement by which we can keep good food from the stores. Or else we may take our own way to keep ourselves from starving. When men are hungry, they help themselves." So, those are the books that I'm prepared to talk about today. And last night this came up at the panel discussion. So I'm not a miserable person. I do stories about these sorts of things. And my goal in them is to sort of perpetuate the memory of someone. So I actually find this kind of uplifting, despite the fact that they're riddled with sad stories. But that's the purpose behind it. And also, as a printmaker, I showed you Kate Kollwitz before. She is able to do a single image, and it just says it all. I can't do that. When I try to do it, I end up solidly in cliche land. So for me, once I found the book format, it allowed me to sort of extend and use story and use text and balance text together with image, and also to have a kind of like almost a movie-like flow to it. and where I thought that then I could at least get part of my feet out of the cliche world. And then I guess the other question that sometimes comes up is, if you're doing these things, why are you doing them in a book form? So I like the rhythm of the book. My books are fairly traditional. If you go upstairs, you're going to see sculptural books, all that sort of thing. I would not have really a clue of how to go about that. I don't feel at all qualified to do that. And for me, just the sort of like fairly page-turning type book has enough sort of flexibility and challenge to it that I'm comfortable with that, and I stay there. You know, either that's a good thing, or else it's just lack of creativity. But I really like how a book can have a certain sort of impact. And last night on the panel, one of the moderator, she teaches at Puget Sound, and she had a letter from a kid talking about how a particular book, I don't know what book, I don't know if it was mine or somebody else's, really turned him around. You know, it was really meaningful to him. And that intimacy, that sort of like connection of like me in the studio to somebody that I don't even know or know when it's happening, that kind of message in a bottle sort of thing, that's really what I like. And so I guess in some ways it's sort of silly to not sort of be using the internet and that kind of stuff, and instead to keep it in this kind of limited realm. But I've always loved going to special collections. I've loved going to print studies and that sort of thing. And I remember back when I was a student, I had this moment of looking at 4 states of Rembrandt, and Rembrandt's 3 crosses, and feeling like such a privilege that here I was, like a 19-year-old kid that didn't know anything, and I'm looking at these things. They don't have glass, and they've just been pulled out for me, you know. And the immediacy of that, you know, across generations, across hundreds of years, I think is just an amazing thing. And I did a lot of prints that sort of stay in drawers, and I would go to print conferences, and a lot of times printmakers would complain, like, why isn't anybody paying any attention to us? And I started to think, well, maybe if you did something that engaged the community in some way, then maybe the community would be a little interested, you know? So books were an avenue for that for me. And it is really interesting to me like last night I was meeting people, and they said, oh, you know, we've been looking forward to meeting you. We saw this book or whatever that. And, you know, when you have no idea that that's going on. So I've really appreciated that, and of course being asked here, and it's really interesting. It's like this different avenue of connection that I would have never really expected, and that I appreciate a lot. So I'm going to end there. We have time for questions, and then I don't know, cookies after that. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you do your own bookbinding? Is it always traditional bookbinding?
Yes, I do my own binding. I'm not great at it. It's not the part of the book arts that I feel terribly confident in. I'm functional, and I've experimented with a few different formats, but I tend to stick to pretty sort of like turn the page type formats.
Wait, but like did you find that yourself?
Yeah. So this one's letterpress. A lot of them are silkscreen. So letterpress is a relief method where you can also do text. I've worked in letterpress, intaglio, and relief and silkscreen for the books. A lot of my books are also kind of big. This one isn't, because I was letterpress and the press isn't that big, but a lot of them are sort of large. Yeah.
How many copies do you make of each one?
Yeah, usually somewhere between 20 and 30 of each. You know, with Deeply Honored, some people were interested in getting a copy, and then I feel sort of bad because it's like, well, they're kind of expensive. There's only 25 of them, and you know, people think like, well, you know, I'd like to have a book, you know. And so if it were possible to have like maybe some kind of like trade publication for certain stories would be kind of cool, but I have no idea how to do that. I've written a few presses to see if they'd maybe be interested and didn't hear back. And it's kind of, you know, this I can do. This is me in my studio making this stuff and putting it out. But another aspect I don't know quite. Yeah.
What first drew you to doing socially engaged work? How did you first feel compelled to do this kind of work?
Okay, so this is Beverly. We taught together our first 2 years of teaching, so you were part of it, and because you were a good example. And then I think it was really looking at the print history, and that sort of thing. And then I tried for a while to do sort of like singular images, and I would either go like so obvious that it was a cliche, or else I would go sort of so metaphorical and poetic that nobody would get it. And you know, between those two poles, both failing in different ways. And I think once I got to the book and I had to sort of like kind of run of the pages, then it was easier for me.
And one thing I wanted to share with you is your book about child abuse, which
Yeah.
you sent to me many years ago.
Yeah.
I've been sharing it with students in my Art in a Time of War class, where we
Oh.
talk about violence
Yeah.
in all its forms and art that deals with violence, and it has moved so many students. So there's
Oh.
your message in a bottle.
Yeah.
A lot of the students have felt like they have permission to talk about
Oh.
really difficult wounds in their lives,
Oh.
including vets who I work with at UW-Tacoma. So
Oh.
it's, your work is very important. So
Thanks.
I just wanted to acknowledge that.
Thanks. So she's talking about a project that I did. I mentioned it briefly. So we would do kind of like not very complicatedly made books, but we would do them in large editions and then send them to high schools. And I was trying to think of topics or issues that were relevant to high school students. And so I did one about domestic violence, and then I did one about a kid who lived with a lot of disease and the fact that he was coping with that, but he was upset that he didn't have any friends, and you know, things like that. And some of them were okay, and some of them weren't. The one that Beverly mentions about domestic violence, it's interesting that some of the schools sent it back because they didn't want to get in trouble with parents and that sort of thing. So then the principal would send it back, and then the counselor would write and say, well, I know they sent this back to you, but could you send it back to me? And you know, things like that. So. And then just recently, I got a note from somebody that said, well, I found these things in the library, and can you tell me about them, and that kind of stuff. So I imagine some of them didn't last, and so maybe some of them did, and that's probably the way they go. Yeah, back there.
Could you talk a little bit about your process in building a book? You spoke about brevity,
Yeah,
and you also spoke about rhythm.
yeah.
So do you edit your books? How do you proceed to assemble a book?
Yeah, so I have to start with the text. So, and then I do a mock-up. So I think about what paper I'm going to use, because then that gives me an idea of the size, because I like to think about using it somewhat economically. And then I think about how it's going to be bound, and then I put together a mock-up. So I just get some cheap paper, and I fold all the pages, and I number them. You know, piece 1, page 1, signature 1, etc. So I have to know how it's going to be bound in order to do that. And then I take them apart. And then I start to, I do little things of text, and I tape them on, and I do images, and I tape them on, and then I put it all together, and I think, no, I don't like this. I'm going to switch this around, or I'm taking this out, or whatever. So a big part of it is in that sort of like sloppy mock-up stage. Then after that, I take each piece from the mock-up, and now it tells me what to do on a piece of paper as I print, and both front and back. And then I kind of like mark it off as sort of, I've got a clipboard, you know, and said, you know, that piece is done, this piece is done, and that kind of stuff. And then I just kind of like lay them all out. So at one point I need a big table that has all the pieces, and then I collate. And then when I collate is also kind of quality control. So at that point, if I run into a page that's kind of really has a print flaw or something like that, I throw it out. So then maybe my edition size is going down a little bit. Get them all collated into stacks, and then I start binding. And then usually that entails first sewing, and then creating the cover, and then casing it in. And covers are really important. So I tend to sort of kind of agonize a little bit about what the cover is, and so oftentimes while I'm doing the longer thing, most of my books I've probably printed 4 or 5 different covers, and they're just sort of like they get trashed and until I come to the one that I'm going to use. Does that answer you okay?
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you know what your next project is yet? And if so, can you tell us about it?
Yeah, you know, the hardest thing is to figure out the next one. And I can tell you something I'm interested in, but I haven't taken any steps at all. And if I do, I'm going to need help because I don't have connections to the White Earth Reservation. But I know that the White Earth Reservation was initially, this is in northern Minnesota, it was initially set up in a way that would really be sustainable. There was enough land, there was the diversity of land, so there could be farming, there was pine woods, there was deciduous woods, there were lakes, everything. So it could have been a pretty sustaining area. But then allotment happened, and then lots of ways in which they were basically conned out of their money, out of their land, and that sort of thing. So the native ownership of what had been the reservation is down to 6%. And so I think there's a lot of interesting potential for story there. And but then also, I think some of the people that have bought land under, with good intentions, but then find out that, the title to it is sort of clouded. I think that's another sort of side of the tragedy. So it's this really confused thing where people who own land but don't feel like they own it clear, and other people feel like, well, that would have been ours, and that sort of thing. So, but that's going to be a really complicated story. I don't have any direct connections to the White Earth Reservation. I have a colleague at Carleton that does. I'm thinking of talking to him and see if he could help me out. So that's one that's in the back of my mind.
And
Mhm.
when you have this idea, are you like in these, you always find this personal story, it seems like that you're telling. Are you also then hunting for that, for the whole thing to come together, or?
Yeah, I think if you can get sort of like quotes or letters or things like that show like what it really felt like, then I think it's more important. A book that I didn't mention, because of the centennial of World War I was recently, I wanted to do a book in some way about that, and there are a million images that are really compelling images from World War I, including moving motion picture, in the trenches going like this, and it's just amazing the images that exist from that thing. But I couldn't find a text, and I spent a lot of time in the Historical Society going through letters and that kind of stuff, and they really weren't moving to me. And then I found a book called Anzac, The Other Anzacs, and it was Australia and New Zealand army nurses, and it was their diaries and their letters home, and they were just amazing texts about. And I thought, this is perfect because. The women, the nurses, they're not in the spotlight, and the things they lived through were incredible. And so I wrote and got rights to that, and then did that book.
Thank you.
Yeah. Here?
For your images, your photographic images, are you taking the original film and still working sort of in old school methods, or are you digitizing it right away?
Yeah, the questions about the images, and this brings up also the issue of rights. So in some cases, I'm paying for rights for photographs. In other times, they're kind of open use things. If I can find them from a source where I pay for rights and they come in with really good resolution, I do that. But sometimes I'm taking them just off of open use sort of stuff online. Sometimes it's image grabs from moving images. Other times it's stills, and then sometimes it's limited by maybe they don't come in with enough definition to really be useful. I might have an image that I really like, but I just can't find one that is going to move up to scale very well, and that sort of thing. So that's another thing that happens in the editing process. There's one more? No? Yeah, okay, yeah.
I'm very moved by your being able to bring
to the modern day, these stories of people who have suffered some injustice, and which is probably happens countless times throughout history. And while maybe in the current way we think of media, people can instantly broadcast something to millions without a lot of substance, you seem to be doing something that has a lot of permanence. And even if there's only 20 or 50 copies of it, you're still telling a story. And so maybe it's more akin to art that you need to experience in person. And I wonder, as you teach, what's your message to students? What are you trying to encourage people to develop as storytellers?
Well, I've been really lucky in teaching. I'm in a good place. And I've had a string of really fun people to work with. Well, it's interesting. I mean, because they're all so different, so that I don't. It would be kind of handy if I had one big thing to tell them, but I don't. And one thing I do tell them is if you want to do this, do it. And then if it just gets really hard and you have to quit, you quit. But if you quit now, when you want to do it, then you're going to be cynical later. So get told no a few more times before you quit. So that's one thing. And then after that, it's just trying to find out what they're interested in. And also, I guess another thing is I really don't want a single look in my shop. I don't want to, there's some schools where you go and the senior show is the same pretty much every year. It's really not the case with us, and so I don't want one kind of look or one kind of basic sort of approach or intention to really take hold and be the identifier of the place. That's maybe a little bit vague, but if you're talking like teaching philosophy, we're going to get a little vague. Yeah.
It wasn't really a yes or no kind of
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So you talked a little bit earlier, and people were mentioning how your books can kind of be a message in the bottle. And
Yeah.
you don't really have that connection with who's reading it, but so many of the stories that you talk about in your books are so important, and like you were saying, they're really stories that aren't told very often, or the populations are just so limited.
Mm-hmm.
But I wonder, when you produce these books, do you have a specific plan in mind for getting those books to places where they really could do the most good, or having events that can really project those messages beyond just,
Well, I'll say that last night, I met some people and they said like, oh, I saw this book, I was really looking forward to meeting you. And that was people that saw the book. And then there are people that said, oh, I saw you talking on YouTube. And this is a little scary to me, but I thought, oh, okay, well, I hadn't thought about that. So I think that it's kind of developing sort of a two-pronged sort of thing. I think that there's the books that sit there and people get to them. And like, upstairs they've got one of them where they filmed it. So it goes like this, right? I watched a guy watch it. He watched the whole deal. So you probably have a fairly low percentage on that to watch the whole thing. But that guy did. So that's interesting. And then, then the person alone that gets to turn the pages, that's the best. And then, I guess this kind of public thing like this today, or where sometimes they end up online or that kind of thing, that's a whole nother bit. There are people that are really, really savvy about the online thing. I'm not, and I suppose it could be utilized better. But part of it is I just love that kind of like go to the back room and look at the stuff sort of feel, so I don't ever really want to give that up. Yeah, one more? Yeah?
So what is your general distribution model? Do you create your 20 to 30 pieces of art, and each process takes how long? 6 months, a year?
Yeah.
3 weeks? I mean, I don't know.
Yeah.
So first, like, what is the duration of a project?
Right.
Then, do you say, well, I'm going to send them to all 50 states? Am I sending it to just universities? Am I sending it to...
Okay, great. They usually take about a year. And I've been told that I'm relatively fast in terms of that, but for me it's about a book a year. And I, at first, would throw some in the trunk of the car and kind of drive around the Midwest. And that went okay. And then, or like if we travel, you know, usually I try to go see somebody or two if we travel. And then I met, there's a book dealer called Vamp and Tramp, and they're really lovely people, and they get around. So I've just, basically that's been the distribution for the most part. And you know, I've seen them do their spiel at other places, you know, so I know that at some point they just haul my thing out of a suitcase and they have a little description of it and that kind of stuff. And then usually they go to libraries and special collections at universities and that sort of thing. But I will say that there's a... So I was in printmaking for a long time, right? And in printmaking, you do a print, and I tended to enter competitive print shows all around the country and nationally and internationally. And you mostly deal with UPS. You know, you're sending your thing off, and then you get back the catalog. It's got your name listed and that sort of thing. And it's kind of intramural. So like when I would meet other printmakers, they knew what I was doing. But nobody else that wasn't even looking, that wasn't in those shows, didn't know anything, right? So kind of surprising. I don't do that anymore. But now I've got books and collections. So now I get these notices, and they say, "Oh, you're in a show." And well, that's easier, and it's also more pleasant. And also sometimes, like this show here is a pretty good show, you know. And I was in a show in Alabama, and they sent me the catalog, and it's really an incredible show. And I'm surprised, you know, but they had a copy of my book, so they included me. And then I was also in a show with about the 100th anniversary of the closing of the Carlisle Indian School. So they picked up on it and ended up in it. So actually distribution has really picked up. And again, it's sort of like it got out of the print mold, you know, and it moved into other things, including some that really matter to me, like Library of Congress and stuff like that. Like I'm so glad the Sugimura book is in the Library of Congress. And does that answer okay?
It does, thank you.
Okay. Last one? Are we good? Well, it's a very nice day. I've been told that this is a really surprising turnout given the weather here. So thank you for coming, and thank you to Cynthia and everybody for inviting me here and helping me to get a little introduced to the area where I'm eventually going to come live, and I'll be outside for a while and can talk to you all. Thanks a lot.